Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Fossil Friday Chats. And not just any Fossil Friday Chats, but what turns out to be our 1-year anniversary of Fossil Friday Chats. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us for an entire year. I'm one of your hosts, Brittany Stoneberg from the Western Science Center. With me, as always, for the past year, again, is Gabriel Santos.
Hi, everybody. 1 year. We did it. I should have brought confetti.
We made a mistake. We neglected the confetti. And joining us today is our speaker, Lindsay Farah. Lindsay, good to see you.
Hello, nice to see you guys too.
Welcome today. I'm so excited to have you join us. We're not going to be actually eating any sand dollars, I promise.
Yes, not today.
We did remark in the pre-show that the picture of Lindsay eating the sand dollar that we've used in the promo, to me it looks like a sugar cookie. This is a terrible time to have not had breakfast yet.
Sugar cookie for breakfast? Really?
I mean, it's a pandemic. Why not?
Yeah, okay. No, that's fair. I mean, I drink fruit smoothies for breakfast and it has the same amount of sugar anyway, so whatever.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Lindsay, for joining us. If you're not familiar, Lindsay is an invertebrate paleontologist who's worked on trilobites and echinoids. She's currently working as a paleontology collections assistant at the Cincinnati Museum Center. I'm very excited to have more invertebrate people on the show because, as we've always kind of emphasized, paleontology is not just dinosaurs, as cool as dinosaurs are. If you have any questions for Lindsay, as always, go ahead, put them in the chat. We will get to as many as we are able before the end of the show during our Q&A session after Lindsay's presentation. So Lindsay, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you both. And I wanted to say congratulations on 1 year of Fossil Friday Chats. It's really awesome to be here. And as I was telling Gabe and Brittany in our pre-show, when we were talking about sand dollars looking like sugar cookies, I was also talking about how sometimes in museum specimens, they get granules of sand stuck to them, and then they really look like sugar cookies. So today, I'm going to be talking about my master's thesis research, kind of what's on the menu, sand dollars, and sea biscuits. And we're going to find out what actually thinks these things are tasty. There we go. So starting out, I kind of had an interesting paleontological career. So as a kid, unlike most of the people watching, I was not interested in dinosaurs. But I was interested in learning things, and I was interested in about history. Some of my favorite books to read were The Magic Treehouse, where they went in a treehouse and went to different times in history. And I think they visited dinosaurs at one point too. So when I started out, I wasn't really interested in fossils. So I became interested in the earth sciences in 8th grade. I had a really amazing teacher who did all these cool projects about atmospheric sciences and earth sciences and geology. So when I went to college, I went to SUNY Oneonta, which is one of the state schools in New York, and I became a geology major. I also double majored in anthropology while I was there, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do in geology. There were so many options. We had a faculty member for kind of each of the subdisciplines of geology. So I was super lucky, and at Oneonta, I was able to kind of try out or test out different specialties on different field trips. So this picture on the left is me during my first geological trip ever. It was our mineralogy trip, and this is me using a drill core to get out a long, skinny piece of this igneous rock that we're looking at. And then the picture on the right is me on my first paleontology trip. And on this trip, we got to see sort of Ordovician-aged fossils. So we got to see tiny rolled-up trilobites and a lot of brachiopods and cool invertebrate stuff like that. So once that happened, I did fall in love with paleo, but the invertebrate side, so not really the dinosaurs. Since I was surrounded in New York mainly by invertebrate fossils, that's kind of where my research and my love has led me. So one thing I was really lucky to be a part of at Oneonta was that we were able to attend a variety of different geological conferences. I attended my first conference in 2015, and ever since then, I've been presenting one project or another at these conferences. But they started out as a great way to explore different topics in geology that may or may not have interested me. It kind of helped me to narrow down what I was actually interested in. And eventually it became a great way to network and meet other paleontologists. And now my favorite part of going to conferences is seeing old friends. I've made a lot of friends over the years at different institutions, such as the Florida Museum that I don't get to see all of the time, but when we meet together at conferences, that's my favorite part. So my path so far, once I graduated from Oneonta, I then went on to get my master's degree in geology from Miami University. And Miami is in Ohio, actually. Some people get it confused with the University of Miami in Florida, but I was in Ohio. So again, in a place surrounded by a lot of invertebrate fossils. And again, my talk today is going to be focusing on the research that I did at Miami. But after I graduated, in 2019, I started a lecturing position at Miami, and I also lectured part-time at the University of Dayton. So I got to teach intro to geology classes to pretty much mostly freshmen at both of these universities. And that's actually what I was doing when the pandemic started. So the spring semester of 2020 got to shift to virtual online teaching. Last summer, I got to do a really cool virtual internship with the American Geosciences Institute and the Paleo Society. And I got to do a research project where I focused on what happens to museum collections when that museum shuts down. So what we call orphan collections. And what was really cool about that project was I got to interview a variety of collections managers from museums all over the country, and even some in Canada too, to see what they were doing with their collections, how their collections and their museum was faring during the pandemic. And it really connected me with a lot of different people. And then currently I'm working as a collections assistant at the Cincinnati Museum Center, again, mainly focusing on invertebrates because that's where my love lies. And I got to do a lot of stuff there. They just received a collection from the University of Minnesota. That collection kind of closed down. The museum didn't, or the university didn't want to take care of it anymore, so Cincinnati is taking it on. So it was a really nice segue from my summer internship into my current position. And through all of my path so far, I realized that I really love working in museums. So during my master's thesis, I was able to travel and visit and work with collections at museums, both internationally and nationally. So this picture on the right of me on the stepladder is me at the Smithsonian looking at echinoids for this project. And the picture on the left is me in front of the British Museum in London, which I got to travel to, again, for this project that I'm going to talk to you about later. My favorite part is exploring and discovering cool things behind the scenes of museums, which is why I'm so interested in collections. But recently I've discovered that I really do have a passion also for education and outreach. So moving on into my project. As I said, I'm going to talk to you today about echinoids, so sea urchins, sand dollars, and I'm going to talk to you about what ate them. So to get started, in the modern world, in modern ecosystems, we can see different organisms interacting with each other with our own eyes. So for example, these pictures here, you can see this cheetah attacking this gazelle. And you can watch that happen. So you know that these two species interact with each other. You can also see these birds that help crocodiles pick food out of their teeth. And both of these relationships can be seen with our own eyes. However, in the fossil record, we don't get to see creatures interacting like this live. You only get the bones and the skeletons of organisms. So how do we know that these interactions took place at all in the past? So sometimes you get really, really lucky, and these interactions are preserved in the fossil record. So here we have a skeleton of a snake, and you can see kind of down where this arrow is pointed, a rodent skeleton, a lizard skeleton, excuse me, inside of the snake. And actually inside that lizard skeleton, there's a little exoskeleton of a bug as well. So we can assume, using the fossil record, that the lizard skeleton is inside of the snake because the snake ate it, and that the bug skeleton is inside of the lizard because the lizard ate it. So do these interactions, can we see more of these types of interactions in the fossil record? The evolutionary importance of these, what we call biotic interactions, is contentious. So are prey evolving better skeletons in order to withstand the predators that attack them? Or do predators evolve sharper teeth in order to better attack their prey? So kind of which way does it go, or does it go both ways, or neither? However, currently predator-prey interactions are predominantly studied in the fossil record using mollusks or clamshells, as you can see over here on the right. You may have picked up clamshells on the beach with sort of these holes through them. And these are evidence that they were drilled or eaten by their predators, mainly snails. But you can see in these clamshells that these holes are nearly perfectly circular. They're very distinctive. You can see them with the naked eye. They're very easy to spot. But we were wondering, can we also identify traces like these on echinoids? And these traces, especially the ones made by snails, so the ones I'm showing you here, are made by snails because snails have what we call a radula, or a thorny tongue. And since their tongue, this is the 3 pictures on the bottom here, shows the thorns or the spikes on the tongue. Since the tongue is so thorny, it kind of acts like sandpaper or a drill bit when you're drilling into a wall. They kind of drill a hole through the shell or the skeleton of their prey and then suck out all of the delicious insides. So again, we know this happens with clams. You can see it very distinctively, but does this also happen with echinoids? So just to reiterate echinoids that I'm looking at, we looked at sea urchins. Those are the spiky ones, sand dollars, and then the last one most people are not as familiar with, but they're sea biscuits. They're kind of similar looking to sand dollars, but just a little puffier. And I have a video here showing how a snail radula actually works. So how this thorny tongue is able to drill into its prey. Oops. I like to fast forward too fast. So how this tongue is actually drilling into its prey. And you can see through the mouth, you can kind of see that tongue kind of poking out and scratching. And basically, again, that's acting as almost a drill bit if you were drilling a hole into your wall. And that's how snails drill into and then suck out all of the insides of their prey. So in the modern, we can see a variety of organisms that feed on echinoids. You have your snails, sea otters. I'm sure many of you have watched the cute videos of sea otters bashing rocks on sea urchins in order to crack them open and eat the insides. It's the most adorable videos ever. Sea stars and birds also eat sea urchins and echinoids. Crabs will as well, so will fish and turtles, and even humans. So the insides of sea urchins are a delicacy in many countries. I have not personally been able to try one yet, but that is on my food bucket list. So hopefully I'll be able to do that soon. But again, all of these are creatures that we can watch interacting with echinoids in the modern. We can see these interactions happening with our own eyes. However, in the fossil record, as I said, these interactions are not really well preserved, but we can assume that a lot of the predators that are eating sea urchins today also ate them in the past. So the main predators and parasites that I'm going to be looking at in my study are these cassid snails. Those are the ones on the left. These are pretty big snails, about the size of a softball. And those are going to be the predators. And then we're also going to be looking at eulimid snails. These are parasitic snails on echinoids, and they're a lot smaller than the cassids are. They're about the size of your fingertip. And both of these types of snails are still around today, and they do interact with echinoids today as well. So we know that these predators and parasites interact with echinoids today, but are we sure that they interacted, or how sure are we that they interacted with echinoids in the past? So in this diagram here, on your left-hand column, those are all of the predators or parasites that we looked at in this study. So you have a cassid snail, a eulimid snail, and a crab. This middle column shows the traces or scars that are left behind on the echinoids in the modern. So these are all modern echinoids. And you can see this hole up here on the first echinoid. This was made by a cassid snail. So basically, we let the cassid eat the echinoid and then took it off, and this is the hole that was left over. This middle picture, E, shows this arrow pointing to a different trace or hole created by the parasitic eulimids, which are still attached in other spots on this echinoid. And then lastly, in H, this is again a modern echinoid that was preyed upon by a crab. And the crabs come at echinoids and sand dollars in a different way. They kind of like snip off the edges. So you can see over here on this edge, it kind of has a huge chunk taken out. The crabs kind of use their pinchers as scissors and snip off the edges. And then in this last right-hand column, we see fossil echinoids with similar looking traces left on them. So you can see on C, there's almost the exact looking hole as you can see on B, almost in the exact same spot too. In F, that white arrow is pointing to another small trace, probably we can assume to be left by a eulimid. And then in I, the bottom edge there is snipped off, similar to that modern echinoid in H, which again, since it has the same type of snipping that we observed modern crabs to do to modern echinoids, we can assume that this type of behavior was also going on in the past as well. So making a lot of assumptions with the fossil record, but again, this is kind of what paleontologists have to do because again, we cannot see these interactions happening with our eyes. We kind of have to infer that what is going on today probably also happened in the past. So for my whole project, we looked at a large amount of fossil echinoids from different museums. And each of the fossil echinoids kind of looked like this picture here. This picture shows the top on the left side and the bottom of the echinoid on the right side. This hole in the middle on the bottom, that's its mouth, whereas these other two holes are left by predators or parasites. So we looked through each of these museum specimens and we looked to determine the following things: whether the specimen was drilled or undrilled. Did it have a trace or did it not have a trace? We then looked at how many traces or how many drill holes were left on the specimen. We then measured the size of the test, and the test is just what we call the skeleton of the echinoid. So we measured length, width, height of every single one of the museum specimens that we looked at. We then recorded the location where these echinoids were collected, the age, the depositional environment, and then what type of life habit did these echinoids have. If they were sea urchins, they're more likely to live on top of the sediment, whereas if you're a sand dollar, you're more likely to bury under the sediment in order to hide yourself from predators. So we thought that documenting life habit might help us to determine if living above the sediment left you more exposed to predators or not. We then documented the abrasional grade, or how worn away was the specimen. Could you see all of the features of the echinoid, like this star-shaped pattern here, like you can in this picture? Or did it kind of just look like almost like a ball of rock, like no identifiable features at all? We then measured the size of the traces. So each individual hole, how big was it? And then the main part of my project was, what shape is the hole? And does the shape of the hole kind of tell you which predator or parasite was attacking it? We also documented the trace location. So was it on the top of the test or the bottom of the test? Again, the skeleton of the echinoid. And then we made an interpretation of how the trace was created. Was it by a predator? Was it by a snail? Was it by a crab? Was it by a parasitic snail? All of these different things. And that was pretty much all of the data we collected, again, on a variety of museum specimens. So in my project, I looked at pretty close to 9,000 specimens of echinoids, so each individual small echinoid. Through that, we looked at 131 different species, whether they be sea urchins, sand dollars, sea biscuits, from 193 different localities. We utilized 6+ museum collections. We actually went to a few more after I made this chart. And we actually were able to look at specimens from 20 different countries and 33 different time periods in the geological record. And in total, we found close to 600 traces. So of those 9,000 specimens I looked at, there were only 600 traces, which is a lot less than I had imagined when I started off with. And this data is important because a lot of studies previously had looked at traces and different shapes of traces, but when they did so, they looked at a small geographic area, so maybe one part of Florida. With our study, we wanted to expand that. We wanted to look at multiple time periods, and we wanted to look at a large geographic range. So as I said, we had specimens from 20 countries. All of the countries that we had specimens from are highlighted here in gray. Most of our specimens are coming from North America, especially the United States, because this is where we're based, so that's where most of our specimens came from. And in addition to this, again, we had 33 different geologic time periods. So we were able to look at echinoids from the Jurassic all the way to modern day. So we had echinoids from all of the times in between. Once we looked through all of these echinoids and determined their different traces, we then were able to create a classification system. And we came up with 8 different trace shapes. The most common one being circular, where the length is equal to the width, basically just a circle, like most of the traces I have already showed you. We then had a shape called figure 8, which is basically just 2 circles stuck together. The irregular trace shape was kind of a catch-all. If it was jagged on any side or was all over the place, we threw that into the irregular category. Linear is kind of a stretched out shape. Notched has a circle with a little edge on it, and I'll show you pictures of these on the next slide. Then we had elongated, which is kind of an oval shape, rectangular, and subcircular. So again, 8 trace classes where all pretty close to 600 of our traces were able to fit into one of these categories. And again, these are our 8 class shapes, and with a diagnostic picture of each of these shapes. So A, you can see circular, pretty defined. Those look almost exactly like those circular traces I showed you on the clams earlier. So most of these circular traces we believe are caused by snails, again using their radula or their thorny tongue to drill a hole into their prey. B over here is a subcircular type trace. C is elongated, it's a little oval. D is this irregular shape, it's jagged on one edge, kind of smooth on the other edge. E is our rectangular. F is figure 8, it's kind of got almost like a snowman body shape, 2 circles next to each other. And this is important. Figure 8 shapes are important to us because we believe that it might be what we call a parasitic pair, or a male-female pair of parasites who drill into the echinoid skeleton next to each other so that they can mate and feed on the echinoid at the same time. So basically, living next to each other on the echinoid skeleton. G is that notched shape. It's got a circle with a little kind of half circle coming off of it, or a little indent. And notched traces and all of these other shapes that are not circular are really important to this study because, as you have seen, because of the radula, snails usually drill in a circular formation. On the clams, you can see those beautiful, nice circular shapes. However, what's different about echinoids is that sea urchins, sand dollars, sea biscuits, they're made up of interlocking plates. So all of those plates kind of grow together and create the whole skeleton of the echinoid. But sometimes, if a snail is too big or if it drills in the wrong spot, instead of making a circle, they'll actually punch out one of the plates, which is why we see such a wide variety of shapes in these traces. Because they're so big, instead of just drilling the circle, they're also punching out another part of the skeleton. And then linear trace shapes, which are kind of interesting. These are probably created by parasitic worms that bury themselves underneath the skin of the sea urchin or the sand dollar and kind of live there and create a little groove for themselves. So it's almost like a worm burrow. And again, these are our 8 trace shapes that all 600 of the traces we identified could be categorized into one of these 8 trace shapes. Now, when we were defining the ecology or whether these traces were made by a predator or a parasite, we looked at one thing in particular, in general, and it was the size of the trace. So if the trace was a small, very small circle, we generally identified that as being caused by parasitism. Because again, the parasitic eulimid snails are very, very small. Again, they're like the size of your fingertip. Whereas the predators, especially the cassid gastropods or the cassid snails, leave larger holes because they're bigger. Cassids are generally the size of a softball. So we looked at this in order to kind of sort through whether a trace was parasitic or whether it was from a predator. Again, since we can't actually watch the predators and parasites interact with the echinoids in the fossil record, we kind of have to make these larger assumptions. Now, the very cool thing about my project, and we're going to go through this graph step by step, I know it's crazy looking, is starting on the left, we have our geologic time scale. So we start at the bottom here in the Jurassic time period. That's when I started my project. And again, why did we start with the Jurassic? Well, that's when sea urchins started evolving. That's when they started to really be up and coming in the oceans at this time. We move through the Cretaceous, we move upwards through the Cretaceous and into the Paleogene and the Neogene. Now, during the Paleogene, especially in the Eocene time period, that's when sand dollars and sea biscuits really start to explode. They start to increase in numbers and they start to become more popular and live in various places around the globe. So they really start to increase in numbers during the Eocene. And at this time, when they're increasing in numbers, we also see an increase in the number of specimens that have traces. So we see an increase in traces, and we see an increase in the types of traces. So more than one of those different trace shapes. So the size of the gray circles correspond to how many traces there are. So the bigger the gray circle, the more traces there are in that time period. And as you can see, there are a lot more gray circles up between the Eocene and recent times. What's interesting is that we also start adding other types of trace shapes as well. So we start to see the rectangular trace shape, the figure 8, the notched, and the linear trace shapes during this time as well. So the number of echinoids is increasing, and the number of different shapes is increasing. Now, what else is happening at this time that's really cool is that the number of both cassid snails and eulimid snails are also increasing during the Eocene as well. So because my project looked at so many specimens from so many parts of the world and in so many time periods, we're able to see that the number of traces corresponds with an increase in the number of echinoids and an increase in the numbers of their predators and parasites as well. So at this time, basically, there's this whole feeding fest because there's so many more predators, so many more echinoids to be eaten. And we also see an expansion of the different types of traces or the different shapes as well. So basically, once the Eocene started and the predators increased in numbers and the prey, or the echinoids, increased in numbers, there was just an increase in the amount and the types of interactions that we can see at this time. So kind of to wrap it all up, with this project, I was able to successfully identify about 600 globally distributed biotic traces from the Jurassic time all the way to the recent. All 600 of these traces can be fit into one of our 8 trace shape classes. Most of these traces are roughly circular. That was the most common trace shape, which again is not surprising because snails create this trace shape because of their thorny tongue that drills in. What's really cool about this is all of these traces were visible to the naked eye, and we don't really need high resolution imaging to see these traces. And the coolest thing that I found during this project is that both the number of traces, so the frequency, and the diversity of the trace shapes increases through time, especially during the Eocene. And we presume that this happens as new ecological behaviors evolved. And this also coincides with an increase in the diversity of both the predators and the parasites. So again, as these things evolve together, they interact in new ways, and they're able to create new interactions that we can, hopefully I prove to you that we can see in the fossil record. So looking at things that we can't watch like we can with modern day animals, but showing you how we can kind of assume that these creatures are interacting with each other in the past. And I'd like to thank all of the following people and all of the following institutions for help with my master's thesis and funding for my master's thesis. And I will leave it with our favorite picture of me eating an echinoid, and ask if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That is so cool.
I love those kind of stories because it's like it's an oversimplification, yes, but it's like
Yeah.
here, look, here's a tiny hole that you're able to look at, and all of a sudden you look at a few more tiny holes, and then you've got this great picture of like how things were changing over like millions of years, and it's just so cool to me to be able to like say that or to see that kind of story take shape.
Yeah, when I was when I first started out looking at my first few echinoids when I started, I was just like, "Oh, I don't really see what's going on here." But once you put all 9,000 of your data points together, you're like, "Whoa, this actually makes a lot of sense."
That's crazy.
9,000 data points.
Yeah. I was like, for my master's thesis, I was like, oh my gosh, I had to do 400 specimens. That was a lot. And then you said 9,000. I was like, oh, I shouldn't. I
Oh.
have to take back everything I said about my
Yeah.
master's thesis now.
Once you
My
get in a groove, because they're so small, it's really easy to just measure, especially when they don't have any traces on them and you're just measuring. You really get into a groove.
and here like my paper, I had just over a dozen horse teeth to reference. We looked at a lot more in collections, but we directly referenced maybe over a dozen horse teeth. And here I was like going through my data set, like, oh man, gotta write all this down. It takes so long. I'll never say that again.
I I think that's one of the
And I
like
think I think it's good. Go
uh,
ahead, Gabe.
I was gonna say I think that's one of the cooler aspects of invertebrate paleontology is just like the sheer
Yeah.
number of data points you get. Right, invertebrate paleontology, we're working in tens, maybe hundreds, like on rare occasions, but for invertebrate paleontology, because you have it in the thousands, you get like these much more clearer pictures of the past because you have that huge data set, right?
Yeah, working with invertebrate paleo is really cool because every museum we went to, I would basically just get a little box and it would have 100 tiny echinoids in it. And I'd just go through one by one. But yeah, huge data sets because there are just so many of them.
And I think what's cool about having that large data set is also, through traces and things like this, how much you can infer about the behavior of these animals, which is often a lot harder to do in vertebrate paleontology. We're just jealous, we're just here. We're
Yeah.
like, oh, yeah, we're just jealous vertebrate paleontologists sitting here.
Yes, invertebrates are awesome.
When you were doing your data analysis and looking at the holes, was there like a point where you're just like in auto mode, where like because you had 9,000 specimens to go through, and you were just like measuring and not even really like thinking, you were just like automatically doing it?
Yes, yes. I spent 2 weeks at the Florida Museum my first year, my first summer of my master's thesis, and I was doing like 500 specimens a day almost, and basically just like boop, 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 one after the other, definitely on autopilot there.
Whoa,
See,
500.
that's good because there
Cause
was a tofu eating cat had actually asked how many hours did it take you to get through all of those?
Yeah, so they weren't consistent. So during the school year, because I still had to attend classes and stuff, during the school year, I was working maybe 2 days a week for 3 hours a day. But then over the summer was when we did our really big data collection and we went to different museums. So when I visited Florida, I was there for 2 weeks and basically working 8-hour days, or seven, including lunch. Uh, but just all 7 hours looking at those specimens. So yeah.
You dream of them? Be like, oh,
Yeah, they
I
definitely
feel like
got
they were just calling me.
stuck in your head.
Um, this is a good question from frequent viewer Mermaid Labs. Did you get a feel for why there were so many fewer traces than you were expecting?
So I think that a lot of times again, since cassid snails are usually so much larger than the echinoids themselves, you can see in this picture, or in the picture that I had where I'm eating it, it's about the size of my hand, and cassids are generally a little bit bigger than that. But a lot of times cassids will jump on top or slowly move on top, and their weight just breaks the sea urchin. So a lot of times there were fewer traces than I had expected when I started out because of this breakage of the skeleton, about how fragile the skeletons of sea urchins are. So a lot of times they don't get preserved, but when they do, they're really cool. But yeah, there's a lot of breakage that happens.
Wow. That's so
crazy.
That's
For
intense.
Okay, sea urchins we know sea urchins have like that like spines for defense, right?
Yes.
Do sand dollars have that too, or do they have some kind of form of defense against these like predators that drill into them?
So sand dollars and sea biscuits really don't have the spines. They do have some. Sometimes they have like small spines near their mouth, so on the bottom side. But their main defense against predators is burying themselves into the sand. So that's why sand dollars are so flat, so that they can burrow themselves easier into the sand. So they basically just run away.
Run away. Can't blame them. Let's see. This question is from Alton Dooley. Any idea what led to the increase in echinoids diversity during the Eocene?
So we're still really working on that, but basically the increase in diversity kind of happened after what we call the Mesozoic Marine Revolution, which is kind of this huge arms race between predators and prey. So predators evolving better ways to attack, prey evolving better ways to defend themselves. And the Eocene is kind of slightly after that. But it's when we do start to see a lot more of what we call infaunal echinoids, or the echinoids that are starting to bury themselves under the sand. So that's when they really started to diversify, and that's kind of about the period of the time where we see an increase in that echinoid diversity as a whole.
Cool. Mermaid Labs has another question. To what level of precision bleh, did you measure the traces?
So for the size of the traces, we were about to 0.1 millimeters precision. That's the word. But yeah, for location, I'm not quite sure if that means size or location on the echinoid, but location on the echinoid, we basically divided the echinoid into 5 sections and just said like which section it was in.
It's like a little echinoid pie chart.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, that's what happens when you have radial symmetry, right? It's pretty easy to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
Vertebrates and their body plans.
In your presentation, you were saying how like all these like traces were like really easy to see with the naked eye, but like, you know, for folks at home, what kind of tools did you use to like measure these and like get like estimates of where they were? Did you just like use a ruler or something?
So yeah, to measure them, I used digital calipers, which are basically the kind of tong-like things that open up. And then since they're digital, they tell you what the measurement is, so you don't really have to look for a ruler. But yeah, most of these traces are large enough that you can measure them with just using a ruler.
That's so cool.
But we were using digital calipers just to be a little bit more precise. And then the pictures I showed you of the traces on the echinoids, I took using a microscope camera, but just to blow it up a little bit so it's easier to see.
Calipers are one of those tools that just make me feel so cool whenever I use them.
Yes.
Just
it's like feel... Yeah, it's weird. It's like how sciencey you feel when you're like just measuring a fossil and you're just get that, and all of a sudden you feel like the lights change when you're doing it. It's like you're like in a movie scene just measuring a fossil with a caliper.
And yeah, it's basically a glorified ruler.
It really is.
But
Yeah.
it makes
And
you feel so cool.
Going through thousands of specimens, I definitely was like, wow, I'm so good with these calipers now.
Um, oh goodness. This question is from Lucas. Have you found any oddities or unique markings in the specimens you work with?
Um, One cool thing that I didn't put a picture up of, but is in the overarching project I work on is called the Echinoid Associated Traces Project, or the EAT project. And one of my coworkers, Liz Petsios, was looking more at the parasitic traces. And one of the cool things we found was in a fluid preserved echinoid. So a modern one, but in the fluid collections, I can't remember which museum you were at, but in the fluid collections, sometimes on the spines of sea urchins, you get these kind of swellings. And we CT scanned one of those swellings, and inside you could see a female eulimid snail, a male eulimid snail, and eggs.
A whole little
Whoa!
Yeah.
Inside the sea urchin
Inside
spine?
the
Oh,
swelling
no.
on a spine of a sea urchin. And
That's
that
so
is the coolest thing.
Those are just like little discoveries. There's like, oh, nature.
Sure, just having your family vacation in a sea urchin. Oh my goodness.
And speaking of
That's
like oddities and stuff, when you were going through like specimens that came from like the late Pleistocene and like the Holocene, did you find any like traces that were made by humans of any kind, or is that like something you don't see really?
um, I didn't really see any of those traces made by humans. Like, I know we see a lot of like clamshells that are drilled for like necklaces and stuff, which is so totally cool. And crinoid stems being used as necklaces. Um, I didn't really see anything on the echinoids that would have pointed to a use like that. Um, but maybe they just weren't put in my collection. The collection that I like
yeah, collection bias,
moved to anthropology.
This is a cute question from Mermaid Labs. In regards to modern sea urchins, do they stick leaves on top of their spines on purpose for camouflage, or is that an accident? They say, I always imagine them running around looking for leaves to wear. It's just such cute imagery.
That really is a cute imagery. I'm not 100% positive. I would love to say that they go around looking for camouflage, but it probably just happens on accident.
That's like
Aw.
something out of a Ghibli film, a Studio Ghibli
Uh-huh.
film,
Yes.
like the little sea urchin with the little seaweed umbrella on the top.
Oh my goodness. Somebody, we have some artists in this chat. If anybody feels compelled to draw this,
Oh my god,
please
that
do.
would be so cute.
Or a little
Uh,
sea biscuit with a
oh,
leaf.
that would be every time, this is just a little bit of Hemet trivia where we were at. Every time I hear Seabiscuit, I just remember that movie was filmed in Hemet years ago.
Yes, the one about the horse.
And that was filmed in
Oh,
the same city as our museum is in. So every time I hear Seabiscuit, I'm like, right, the horse movie.
Yeah,
I
every
didn't make
time I
that.
say Seabiscuit out loud, I'm like the horse. Wait, that's not what I'm looking at.
I didn't make that connection until now. I don't know why I thought sea biscuit was like some like fancy name for like a cookie or something, and then like now I just realized that's what it's named after. Okay, never mind. I'm moving on.
Okay. Um, okay, this next question is from Elian. Although all traces were visible to the naked eye, could it be interesting to look at them under the microscope since it might show some patterns on their outlines that aren't visible?
Yes, exactly. So that was actually part of my project that I didn't share here. A cool thing about traces that are left on clamshells is that sometimes you can actually see like micro scrapes from the radula or the thorny tongue on the sides, so on the inside sort of edge of the traces. So part of my project was to do scanning electron microscope imaging of the traces on the echinoids to see if we could see those at all. The answer is no. Mainly because the traces are so big. It's in the electron microscope, you basically just have the same magnification as a regular microscope. And then since the edges and the plates of the echinoids are so rough to begin with, you aren't really able to see those cool micro scratches of the tongue. But on bivalves, that's a cool thing to look at.
Neat. Okay. This might be our last question, and I think it is absolutely the hardest question we always pose for every guest. What's your favorite invertebrate, modern or extinct?
Ooh, my favorite invertebrate is a hard question because I work with so many. Honestly, I'm gonna have to say sand dollars now that I've worked with so many of them, but just seeing the different shapes that they can come in, like the one I used for my promo picture is pretty the classic shape, but there's also this one type where the middle's kind of inflated a little bit. So it's kind of like pizza dough. Really weird descriptor. It's kind of like pizza dough if you like pushed up your hand through the center and left the edges down. But they have some crazy body shapes.
Isn't there one that's like shaped like a heart, right?
Yes, yes, the
Oh,
heart urchin.
Oh.
I'm going to Google that later. That's
Oh.
adorable.
All right. Well, that's our last question, right, Britt?
Yep, that's it for today.
All right. Well, that was really fun. We learned some really cool things about invertebrates and once again proved that invertebrates are awesome. So thank you so much, Lindsay, for joining us on today's episode.
Thank you for having me.
If people want to learn more about you or your research, where's the best place they can go for that?
Well, I'm on I'm on Twitter. It's at underscore Lynds Lynds 3 and then another underscore. I don't really do too much paleo stuff there, but I guess I'll have to start. So yeah.
Well, there you go. You can start posting more about the cute images of sea biscuits and
Yes,
sea urchins.
honestly, I really should have done that.
You could also like do cooking and make cookies that look like them when you can like make
Ooh,
the little traces. And I'm going too far. That would be really
Yeah,
cute though.
found my new brand content.
invertebrate baking.
Well, we'll make sure we put that in the description below. And so that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And thank you so much to all of our audience. Again,
Thank
this
you.
was our 1 year anniversary episode. Woo! So thank you so much,
Yay!
everybody, for supporting the show for the last year. Thank you so much for tuning in and also supporting all of our amazing guests so far. If you love this program, which we hope you do because you're watching, and want to continue to support it and programs like it at the Western Science Center and the Alf Museum, you can find links on how to do that in the description below. And as always, make sure you like and subscribe for more stories from the world of paleontology. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week. Bye.